Hello everyone. In this video, I want to explore the topic of causality or modality more generally. If modality is even a more general concept than causality, it may or may not be. Uh, we may discuss that, may be open to debate. But let's say that when I was searching for the difference between modality and causality, I stumbled upon a distinction that makes a distinction between the necessity of causality, the necessity of causal connections or relations, and the mere possibility of the enabling conditions, or the merely partial or I guess auxiliary conditions or causal factors that enable but do not necessitate a certain outcome. But I would argue that it lies in the very conception, in the very definition of the concept of causality, that if all the enabling conditions are in place, then they together, they in tandem, they conjoined necessitate the effect or the outcome of that causal relation or causal power. Because if all the enabling conditions were not in place, then the outcome would not happen at all, and those enabling conditions wouldn't really be enabling condition. It's just that we can dissect, we can distinguish perhaps some optional parts of the whole enabling causal condition, but they do not really do their work if they're not all in one place. They do not all work together. But nevertheless, when I'm thinking about the concept of causality and modality more generally, maybe we can mention the concept of essence. The concept of essence, which is pretty much a very, very deep, very fundamental notion of metaphysics. Western for sure, but I would say even Eastern. I think they have cognates. They have also equivalents to that in their own conceptions. And of course, even there, as well as in the Western canon, we have the more realist or more essentialist conceptions, and we have the more, I guess, skeptical or nominalistic or anti-realist conceptions. But when we talk about the concept of essence, at least in some analytic in some circles of analytic metaphysics, in some discussions of analytic metaphysics, contemporary analytic metaphysics, we often find the concept of essence connected to the concept of necessity, where they are understood as essentially related, very closely related, if not coextensive. So what is essential to a certain entity, either an individual entity or a kind of entity, so a general type or class of entity, is understood to be the properties that are necessary for that entity to be the entity that it is, or for some entity to belong to a certain class that it belongs to. So the concept of essence is analyzed in terms of the necessary properties that are necessary for that thing to be what it is, or the kind of thing that it is. But in these kinds of discussions, I would mention, I would try to go pretty deep, actually, in the at least in the history of Western metaphysics, and talk about the early Greek conceptions, ancient Greek conceptions. They start even in the pre-Socratic period, so before Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, probably the three most famous Greek philosophers. But the roots go even deeper than that. Perhaps the roots go even deeper than philosophy itself, Greek philosophy itself, because, even in the mythologies, in the mythological conceptions or images, symbolic representations of the early Greeks, their worldviews. We find something like the concept of fate, right? Like something akin to destiny, not in any sense of like religious belief, but in the sense of destiny. So Fate, not Faith. So the kind of conception of fate was perhaps in a certain sense even a precursor to the to the uh, to the philosophical conception of the ancient Greeks of logos, or some kind of all-encompassing universal rational principle, or principle of rational structure or organization of the whole natural world. But for them, the natural world is simply pretty much the whole world or the whole of existence, because even if they believed in certain sorts of gods or deities, those gods weren't really transcendent to the natural order, natural world, or part of it, pretty much. And there are conceptions even in the mythologies of fate, that kind of I guess that kind of highest force of necessity ruling over even the gods. So even the gods cannot escape fate. Fate is higher even than the gods, but more powerful even than the gods. And perhaps that's the precursor. That's the some kind of a predecessor to the Greek conception of logos as this kind of a universal rational ordering principle of the cosmos, uh, where the cosmos is seen to have a rational or intelligible structure at its base, or it seems to have some sort of skeleton or some kind of structural principle that is then in a certain sense knowable by the logos that belongs more to the human mind and human language. Also the rational principle in the human mind and language that is able to know that kind of a rational principle of the world, objective rational principle of the world. And that perhaps can be understood even if you take, we can take the example of Anaximander, right? When he talks about, well, I guess it's decay, but it's some kind of principle of justice, that is supposed to rule the cosmos. Uh, rule the succession of, coming into existence, arising from non-being, and then passing back into non-being or going out of existence. The kind of justice is supposed to rule out all of those happenings, all of those worldly happenings. Uh, in a certain sense, I may, I'm not tempted to interpret that as a sort of saying that, coming into existence or being born in a certain sort of sense is a somewhat of a sin, somewhat of a transgression, some kind of breaking the balance of the universe that needs to be put back into balance by simply going out of existence. Uh, but yeah, anyways, that's some of the very very early conceptions or representations of what is supposed to be a necessary causal, lawful causal structure of the world, where they suppose that there are some kind of necessary laws, immutable, eternal laws to the natural world, which govern how events in it occur and how they succeed each other. Uh, and they cannot be broken by any mortal will or even by the will of the gods, which were more like much closer to anthropomorphic deities than perhaps some of the monotheistic conceptions. But in any case, that's pretty much the realist. Sounds to me like a very realist way of looking at uh, at causality and modality in general. Well, yeah. Oh, when I'm already talking about the Greeks, why wouldn't I mention the etymological origin of the word cause? Or oh, well, I'm not sure the exact grammatical form, but I think it's idea when we get the word ideological, right? Which means a study of the causes of something, which in Aristotle's sense is the only real form of science. You know a thing when you know its causes. And of course, he has the four types of causes, but etiology is also one of the one of the words or names of Aristotle's first philosophy, as he also calls it himself, etiology. So, study of the first causes of everything, first principles, the ultimate ground, the ultimate causal ground of everything in existence. But I wanted to mention the causal, not the causal, well, in a certain sense, causal now. That's a Freudian slip. In a certain sense, the causal or the genetic origin of the etymological origin of the word atia in Greek, which comes from pretty much as all or most philosophical terms come from ordinary language, everyday discourse, non-philosophical discourse. And the word atia, if I'm not mistaken, is coming from pretty much a legal background, a legal source, where people talked about who is responsible for some kind of crime, right? Someone who is responsible for certain kind of crime, who is to be punished, I guess, for a certain kind of crime or some kind of transgression of the law. He is the idea there. He is the responsible party. He is to be blamed for that which took place and shouldn't have taken place. So we have uh, we have that kind of conception of a responsible, more or less human party, right? Taken to a much higher level of abstraction, much higher level of abstraction, and taken to denote some kind of cosmic principle ordering, cosmic events and happenings. But when I'm already talking about that, why would I mention also Nietzsche? I hope I'm not mistaken here, but Nietzsche had a conception of, well, yeah, Nietzsche talked about free will, and Nietzsche talked about causality, Nietzsche talked about determinism and whatnot, right? So he also, talked about the will as well. The will as a relevant causal factor, at least in the genesis of our actions. But I think he would say ultimately that, at least in some of his texts, in some of his places in his texts, he would say that the idea of causality in the natural world, in the objective world, comes pretty much from, is extrapolated or is extended from the use of causality that we use to denote the origination of our actions from our wills. So we do things because we will them. Willing is some kind of causal factor, some kind of force that necessitates our actions, and we extend it to the whole of the world, and we believe in objective causality. Then we believe in the ontic causality. Well, that could also be even though Nietzsche did not extensively problematize that in the sense that he did not modality. I'm sorry, morality. In his genealogy of morality, that there is also a sort of genealogical account of the concept of cause that I think could be empirically tested, put under more historical scrutiny, but nonetheless it's an interesting idea. How do we get our concept of a cause, which is also connected to that kind of etymology that I mentioned with the Greek concept of idea, right? Which comes from from legal contexts, which is also interesting for Nietzsche because he talks about even the Judeo-Christian morality coming from this kind of debt, some kind of debt that is owned in economic or legal contexts, and that is extended, is kind of projected to the transcendent realm, and is seen as kind of a, some kind of universal human duty, while actually coming from the feeling of ressentiment and feeling of inferiority that wants to compensate its lack of real physical power and real social political power with some kind of transcendent reconciliator or compensator, where the powerful are pretty much seen as the evil ones and the weak are seen as the good ones. Sort of a Nietzsche's philosophy of the power of the will, or the will to power, and that kind of deconstruction of morality. But nevertheless, what I wanted to say about the concept of modal skepticism, that's a very interesting concept to me as of lately. I took you through some more or less extensive history of these concepts, but I want to perhaps go to a bit more contemporary times, where some people, I cannot really find too many explicit defenders of these kinds of ideas, but we can find, of course, uh, not just traces, but we can find pretty detailed defenses of this kind of idea of causal skepticism or modal skepticism in Hume, of course, but also in Quine, right? Because Quine, from a semantic or meta-linguistic standpoint, from pretty much a logical standpoint, wanted to criticize the concept of modality, or well, not strictly causality, but modality more generally, I guess, right? Uh, he wanted to criticize the concept of de re modality as somehow being presupposed in some of our ways of speaking, but he wants to say ultimately that it is also a sort of a imposition or a reading in, right? We read modality into the world that is not original to be found there. Right, we project it onto the world in a certain sort of sense. But some of my, I'm guessing, more original ideas, if you find this kinds of ideas in some previous authors or even contemporary authors, I would urge you to let me know about them, because I would really like to familiarize myself with that kind of a literature or whatever else material or content is available. But I was kind of coquetting with the idea of causality being a sort of overstepping, or the judgments about objective de re, or de re means pretty much in the thing, in the thing itself, in the world itself, where the dicta would mean more like in our language, in our words. De re modality, skepticism about de re modality or ontic modality or real objective modality or causality. Where I think that, at least if we take the starting point, the presupposition of empiricism, we cannot really get at that kind of conclusion via any valid logical means or ways or methods, in the sense that induction is that kind of fundamentally flawed type of reasoning, flawed in the sense that it cannot guarantee its outcome, but what I would also say it cannot even make the outcome or the conclusion probable, uh, because not even the probability of the conclusion follows from the premises themselves. If the uniformity of nature is not already included in the premise, if you do not assume that the future will resemble the past, or or even that the further past, did resemble the present or the nearer past, if that makes sense, uh, or maybe some remote parts of space resemble our own local region of the universe. Those are all assumptions that are kind of implicit in many of the scientific theories of today, and we've seen fundamental physics and whatnot, in this kind of astrophysics or cosmology or whatnot. It is very often assumed that natural laws are universal. Natural laws work across all space-time, at least in our universe. Perhaps some physicists would consider seriously the idea of multiple universes existing beyond our universe, in whatever form that is possible, but which may embody different natural laws, different initial conditions, and the different etiological structure, or the different uh, natural laws, which are pretty much. But I would argue from my own position, taking into consideration the problem of induction and the principal limitations of empirical scientific methodology, natural scientific methodology. I would argue that we can never really reach, with apodictic certainty, the conclusion that any kind of natural law or any kind of necessary causal relation or principle really holds in our world. Because that is a generalization. All of our conclusions in science, and also in everyday reasoning, ordinary inductive reasoning, are pretty much generalizations, even in that kind of pejorative sense of generalization, where many actual or possible variables and factors are by necessity and by definition left out of the consideration. So we can never really take into consideration all the relevant factors, all the relevant variables, all the relevant cases, because the causal law is supposed to be universal. So for us to reach, by kind of complete induction, a universal causal law, a universal natural law, we need to take into account, we need to have observed all the relevant cases or events, which are all cases or events in that category of case and event. Which is impossible, I would argue. I don't think that's even controversial. But anything less than complete induction simply cannot guarantee the truth of its conclusion. So I think there is a certain naive trust or confidence in certain conceptions of science, in its conclusions, in the causal laws that it supposedly establishes, which simply is disproportionate to our level of warrant, to our level of evidence that we can have actually in our experience, which then, according to Hume and according to principles of empiricism, should simply be abandoned, or at least looked at as a hypothesis. Now, I would say, somewhat along the lines of Popperian philosophy of science or Popperian epistemology, I would say that the general causal laws can never be established positively beyond any reasonable doubt, but they can, though, perhaps be refuted or be falsified. That seems like a much less problematic way of establishing or testing those kinds of hypotheses about general causal laws in nature. they can be refuted. So if I say, I don't know, if I say that every time I light my match, some heat will be generated. Okay, so there is a hypothesis, there is a proposition, there is a hypothesis about, and then we can deduce certain empirical predictions, empirical consequences that are, we can deduce empirical propositions that are incompatible with the general hypothesis. And then if some of those empirical propositions turn out to be true in reality, then we have falsified that hypothesis. That is pretty much the basic structure of Popper's logic of scientific revolutions, not scientific revolution, scientific discovery, or the process of falsification. That's how falsification works, or is supposed to work in science, according to Popper. So I'd say every time I light a match, some heat will be generated, and at least one time, just one time, it's enough that I light a match once, and no heat is generated. Then I have simply falsified that kind of universal hypothesis, because it is supposed to hold with no exception. There cannot be not a single exception can happen if that is truly a universal causal principle or natural law. So that is one thing I would say about that. Of course, a lot of modern science rests on those early modern, early modern, and also maybe perhaps a bit later modern thinkers, like, or for example, like Bacon, right, with his Novum Organum, or his new Organon, which is supposed to be a revision of Aristotelian, logic and epistemology into a more inductive approach to knowledge gaining and science. But also we have people like Mill with his inductive logic, where he tried to formulate certain principles of testing of scientific theories by induction. So I will not go into depth here about those, but I may say something like, he formulated some ways of testing scientific hypotheses, where he said that, for instance, yeah, I mean, we can first identify the supposed relevant causal factors or variables, and then we can vary those variables and see which of them influence the desired outcome or the expected outcome. And those that do not simply do not then have that kind of causal connection with that supposed event that is supposed to follow, if they were causally relevant. I hope that makes sense. Maybe I have oversimplified it a bit here, but uh, neither do I want, nor can I, nor that I can enter more deeply into Mill's inductive logic or inductive scientific methodology. But yeah, I mean, I know I said a lot here, but I hope some kind of overarching idea can be extrapolated here. So those are released, yeah, some of the history of these discussions in the West, especially because I cannot really recall specific discussions in the Eastern literature, although I'm sure there are some. Uh, so yeah, I'll outline some major historical conceptions, as well as my own sort of theory and critique, and who I rely on the most, and those are probably who I rely the most probably are human Popper, more or less, more or less human Popper. But also, or have perhaps Quine or Putnam or people like that. But yeah, that's okay. I'm going to explore these ideas more surely in some other videos, and connect them to some other problems and topics in philosophy, which I find very interesting, exhaustively fascinating. So I'm going to leave you with that for now. And as an outro, I may urge you to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Follow me on Facebook and Instagram. You can find my name as my username on YouTube. You can also find me on Facebook, Instagram, WordPress, Substack, and places like that. And you can also find me, which it would mean something to me if you follow me there, but it would also mean something in somewhat different sense if you decided to support me financially via my PayPal account, which I will post a link to in the description, to sort of support this kind of work and pretty much give me more material basis, and even a sort of a Marxist sense, material ground and ability to do these sorts of things, and motivation even to do these sorts of things. So yeah, I'll post a link to my PayPal in the description. And if you have any comments or questions, you feel free to post them also on whatever platform you see this on. So yeah, I will just leave you with that for now, and goodbye until next time.